Hey, welcome to the Kingdom Calibrate podcast, where we host conversations to equip a new generation of spiritually healthy church leaders who lead without ego, serve those around them, and seek to bring forth the kingdom of God wherever they are. So, hey, wherever you're listening from, thank you for joining us today. Where we're going today, episode 102, is called A Theology of Technology. So today, we're going to seek to build a theology around our use of technology, particularly within the church. So all throughout our churches, right, we've seen this rapid increase in the use of tech of all kinds to aid our worship experiences. So everything from moving lights to hazers to giant LED walls to these pristine online broadcast experiences, all these things have kind of made a home within the church. And we've seen more of that and the importance of that ever since COVID has kind of ended, knock on wood. Hopefully it doesn't come back. But amazing as the technology can be, it's far too easy to try to implement the greatest and newest gadgets into our services to try to reach the hippest new generation of Christ followers, right? So the challenge our churches face is this: how do we make sure that our technology aids our church's vision and mission instead of distracting from it? So to help us answer this question, I'm really excited for our special guest today, and I'd love to introduce him. His name is Bob Cochran. So Bob, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, man. I'm excited for the conversation. So Bob, you own a company called Ovation Audiovisual, which serves churches and organizations, at least right here in Ohio, right? So kind
Yep.
of what's your footprint around Ohio?
So we serve predominantly in the Miami Valley, which is the Dayton, Ohio region. And we do some gigs outside of the area, but for right now, we pretty much focus on like the Dayton, Ohio area.
Awesome. And I know we've met a few times to kind of talk about this topic, which is initially kind of how we got connected. And I was really impressed with your heart, not just for audio and video and your skill set there, obviously, but also your heart for serving the local church and serving the mission of the church. And I know we've had some really good conversations about what's it look like for churches to make sure their mission aligns with their technology and vice versa. And I know you've got a real heart for just serving churches and partnering with them. And I love that word. And that's kind of how we got connected. So, Bob, welcome to the Kingdom Calibrate podcast.
Thanks.
And I've got a beautiful list of questions for you that I'd love to lean into your expertise for today.
Let's do it.
All right. Awesome. So, question one for all our church leaders listening out there who really want to know the answers to this question is just like this. The biggest one right off the bat: what's the biggest thing that churches get wrong about their approach to technology when it comes to their services?
Well, I think the thing that most churches are prone to get wrong about technology actually doesn't have much to do with equipment at all. I think the thing that most churches get wrong or are prone to get wrong about technology is actually the human side of technology. It's the operator side of technology. It's the systems side of technology. Um, we work with a lot of churches, and it's not uncommon that we'll go into a church or go into a space, and they're hoping that we can solve a problem that they have by giving them new equipment.
Yeah.
But honestly, most of the equipment that's available to churches these days, even the entry level stuff, is incredibly capable. Capability and complexity go hand in hand. For example, I think about kind of the entry level, sort of most ubiquitous audio console, for example, the Behringer X32. That console has a similar level of capabilities as a console you would have seen in a major arena act 20 years ago.
Wow.
And you can do an immense amount with the equipment that we have available to us today. The big difference between the arena act and your standard church is actually, an arena act from 20 years ago and your standard church is really the people behind the equipment. And an arena act 20 years ago, the person behind that equipment was somebody that was a dedicated professional, and they spent a lot of time, learning the fundamentals of their craft, learning how to use that equipment. And here we are, fast forward today, we have equipment that is every bit as complex and advanced as what a major aggregative had not too long ago. And we are taking our, our weakened warriors, well-intentioned as they may be, and we're putting them behind this equipment. And, it's almost like there's an expectation to make it sound, as good as, something comparable in, the concert world. And it's kind of unfair. And not to say that we don't have willing servants and willing volunteers. I mean, we sure do. But I think that really the limitation these days is more often than not, it's not the equipment. It's actually the operator. It's actually the person behind it. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of churches fail to appreciate how much time it takes to develop that expertise, how much training is needed to really operate that equipment well and operate it confidently. For a tech volunteer, somebody who stands behind a piece of equipment that they know is really consequential to their service, if they make a mistake, it's going to be very public, and yet they feel like they don't understand it. That's not an enjoyable position to be in. And I think if I was to make a recommendation to any church listening, I would say before you put often tens of thousands of dollars into upgrading your equipment, make an investment in your people, make an investment in training them and equipping them, and also appreciate that even if somebody understands the operational knowledge of some of this equipment, meaning, I know if I push this button, it does this thing. There's also an artistic side of it that takes a while to develop. So I think the first thing is really putting an emphasis on building up your team and building up your volunteers and their capabilities. And when I say building up, I mean like be willing to put resources behind it, because there it's hard to find a substitute at this point in time beside putting resources into building up your team and building up your volunteers. But the return on investment on that, I think, is so much higher in many situations than just buying new equipment. I think the second thing that a lot of churches are prone to get wrong about technology is some of the systems that are in place or that need to be in place to use technology well. Great technology can't compensate for a lack of planning. Great technology, can't compensate for, throwing on your technical team, last minute surprises. They still need to know how many people are going to be on the band. They still need to know how many microphones there are going to be. And they still need to know with a decent time to prepare what songs you're going to do and what slides are in or out of those songs. And, those things make a huge difference regardless of the level of technology that you have. And I think we need to be careful in thinking that, by simply pouring a lot of money into technology, that we can offset problems in our systems. So I think those are the two I would say is that number one, a lot of churches just don't give enough emphasis to building up their people and putting resources behind building up their people. And the second one is just putting good systems in place that equip their people to be successful.
Yeah, that's great advice, man. Because I think what I see in a lot of churches that we tend to work with is there's a giant discrepancy between the money that we're willing to invest in new stuff to get the latest and greatest. Because, as sad as it is, in the church world, there's still a lot of perceived competition, right?
Yeah.
And I've heard this over the years where it's like, oh, did you hear what church A down the street just put in? Oh my gosh, they've got this big LED. We need to get a big LED wall because what if people go to that church instead of our church? And that's a topic for a whole other day when it comes to our theology around how we serve to build the kingdom. But it makes me think how much different our churches would be if we put at least equal emphasis on training our people to run the systems we already have, just like you mentioned, as much as we're willing to just throw money at new things and expect people to magically learn how to operate it when we give them no training and no skill set other than, hey, a Saturday every 15 weeks or something to kind of catch up somebody who's already worked a 40-hour work week, right?
Yep. Yep. And, imagine you're the person that has to come into that environment. And sometimes, those people feel like they have targets on their backs, and they feel like they're not confident in what they do. And we have high expectations for how they're going to use equipment, but we never really give them the baseline competency, the baseline information on how to use it well. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of opportunity out there that churches just haven't yet harvested, and there's a lot of potential yet unrealized, just because we haven't really, I think, poured a ton of effort into our people.
Yeah, and I love that, man. If somebody who's, who owns a tech company is saying, "Man, it's as much about the people, if not more about the people than it is about the tech," that speaks for itself right there. I think that's very wise words.
Well,
So,
thanks.
how can churches determine what kind of tech would be helpful to them without just throwing around their money flippantly?
Yeah,
So, how do we start to make that decision process on, like, hey, we know we need some things, but we don't know where to start?
yeah. Well, I think that um, you can waste money on both ends of the spectrum. You can waste money by buying equipment that is inexpensive, but actually is hard to use, or it doesn't actually satisfy the need. And then you can waste money by buying equipment that has way more capability than you're ever going to use. So you can be wasteful on both ends. I think I think the number one thing is first and foremost, and this is a much larger conversation than tech. But figure out, like, what are you trying to achieve as a church, and how can technology play a supporting role in that. Uh, I think here's an example. Let's talk about video. Um, so video is one of the areas of technology where you can spend very little money in terms of how expensive it can be. You can spend a couple $1,000s and have a fully capable setup to stream online. Um, or you could invest, tens of thousands of dollars and stream online, and have additional capability and all that kind of stuff. But I think a lot of churches never really sit down to say, okay, like, what is the fundamental reason we're doing this? And, like, for example, with the video, are we trying to are we trying to satisfy? And I don't want to use the word satisfy, but are we putting all this effort into, like, a few people that are out of town a few times a year?
Yeah,
Do we really want to put tens of $1,000s into solving that, or addressing, that small group of people? Not to mention the money, but also the human capital that you have to put behind that. Now you need camera operators, so you're taking people away from, one serving area to put them behind a camera. You know, and sometimes you need, ideally, a broadcast audio operator. Um, and I think that a lot of churches find themselves just saying, like, well, this is a thing that we have to have, rather than thinking, like, strategic, like, okay, like, what is really the best way for us to use technology to support what we're trying to achieve. And so maybe the answer is, like, well, maybe the podcast of our sermon would satisfy what we're trying to do just as well as building a whole video ministry that involves a ton of resources, a ton of volunteer drain. If the goal is just to make sure that people who are out of town can, at least gauge with the content, even if they can't engage in person, then maybe there's a way to be more effective with your resources. Um, or maybe you say, like, well, we see our online, our stream, as a kind of the front door of the first time visitor experience. Saying, hey, well, we realize that a lot of people are checking us out online before they ever come through our doors. Well, maybe another way to think about that is, what if you hired you know, a video production company of decent capability, hired them to come in and do just an awesome, very thoughtful, very strategic video about what it's like to attend a Sunday morning at your church, and what it's like to be in one of your services, and what the kids ministry experience is like. Um, I think that so many people, or so many churches, just kind of blindly put money and put resources without a real sense of clarity for how it actually helps them to achieve their vision. How it does it really give them the best return on investment, or is it possible to take those resources and allocate them other places that are going to help them achieve that ministry goal better? So I think the first thing is, number one, ask yourself, like, what equipment do we really need to achieve our bigger vision? I think the other thing is to ask yourself what equipment is actually appropriate for our team. So I don't want to pretend that every church doesn't want to do things with excellence in terms of technology,
Sure.
with music, but are you purchasing equipment that well exceeds the capability of your team? Um, and if you are, do you have a clear and precise path for how you're going to get your team up to speed to use that equipment to its potential? I've been in places where, like, I've gone in, and I hope this is not too unkind, but I've gone
Go for
in,
it, man. You can say anything you want on this podcast.
I've gone into places where some other people have done work, and I've seen the equipment that's been installed, and I'm like, man, I mean, this church, God love them, they're doing their best. I mean, they genuinely are doing their best, but their worship team is three people without a drummer, and the worship leader is maturing in their skills. Let's say that, and
Very
they've got a PA that costs $100,000, and I'm like, man, like, you probably could have put those resources in a better place. So it's going to ask yourself, how can is what we're trying to, is the level of equipment that we're looking to buy, is it appropriate for, what we're doing as a church? So I think that's another question worth asking. And I also think that, occasionally it's just worth doing a gut check and saying, hey, am I doing this, or are we buying this equipment because we feel like we're trying to replicate something we see somewhere else? And, are we trying to replicate that because, like, we have a little bit of trying to, I mean, it happens to all of us who are trying to um, catch up with the Joneses. Are we doing it because of that, or are we buying all this technology because we believe that this technology is somehow like a gateway or a linchpin for us to be able to do ministry at that level? And I'll tell you, I mean, technology can be beneficial, and it can open up some new pathways and some new capabilities. But technology is something that enhances what you're already doing. It can't make something out of nothing.
Yeah, exactly
And
right.
so, like, if your church is if your church is authentic, if they're excellent, if it's intentional, and it's got the fundamentals right, after all the fundamentals are right, then maybe it's time to start thinking about, like, how technology can enhance what you're already doing. But technology can't manufacture something that's not already there.
Yeah, that's really good. I think a lot of times we get confused, especially when it comes to tech, of like, is it a means to an end or is it the end itself? Right. And we often view technology as the end. If we only get this thing, then everything else will work out. And the harder conversation with any church leader is to really dig down into exactly what you said. What is the vision here that we're trying to accomplish? So, take away in your mind, what are the cool churches you've been to that you really enjoy the experience of? Because every church out there, and I think you'd agree with this, that the really successful big mega church, the ones that anybody can just hop on YouTube or Facebook Live and watch, they all had a very specific mission and vision in mind, which made them what they are. And they were living into that, right? They probably weren't necessarily copying off somebody else. But as we have a lot of conversations with church leaders, we hear kind of a lot of name dropping of like, oh, we want to create this experience. We want it to be like this. We want it to be like this church. And it's like, man, I just want to hear what your vision is. Like, what's your
Yeah.
vision for the church that God's placing on your heart? And then let's figure out how to build stuff up from there. I mean, do you get that a lot when you're doing installs for churches as well?
Yeah, it's not uncommon at all where people they'll actually pull up images that they've seen of other churches and things that other churches are doing. And I think that there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but I think that where sometimes people are misguided or churches are misguided is they think that the kind of the atmosphere and the effectiveness of that church is because of the technology. And that I mean, like, I haven't so far found a church that actually is true of. Um,
Yeah.
so I think that it's fine to say, hey, let's look at some other settings, to find some inspiration on how we can do things. Especially, like, hey, listen, well, if you're not a technical person and you don't necessarily know how to articulate, all the pieces of equipment that you have in mind, but you could show me a picture, like, that's fine. That is actually really helpful. But I think we have to be so careful with the way that we incorporate technology and the way that we allocate resources for technology, because it can. I mean, sometimes I have to remind myself I swim in expensive waters, and
Yes, you do.
like I'll be talking with one of my compatriots, and I'll be talking. Well, it's only this much money, and then I have to check myself. But wait, when I say that much money, you could buy a car with that much money. Um, and so it's like when you're in this realm of technology where everything can be so expensive so quickly, you have to be really careful, and you have to be kind of constantly saying, like, okay, like, is this really as much as we have to spend to achieve the mission of our church, to achieve the vision that we have in mind? Or is there a more cost effective way to do that?
Yeah. Now that's a great lead into the next question I have for you. So, say we get to this point with churches where we've incorporated this new technology, we've installed it. Maybe we've already gotten to the point we've talked about the vision. We said this is the stuff. Okay, so now it's installed. Now, what's the next step for churches? What do they do with that? How do we start to build, teams around that technology? How do we start to train them? What's all that look like?
Well, I think that, number one, I think it's really important for church leaders to understand the plight of the technician. Um, the, the setting up a stage, preparing equipment, turning it all on, um, even being able to react to changes. Those things all take time. I think about the live world. I do a bunch of live events. If we were to take a stage and set it up from nothing, we would probably have 3 or 4 people that would be dedicated to that task for an hour. Um, and that's with professionals. That's with people who handle this stuff all day, every day. And so now kind of extrapolate that and say, like, all right, well, I have 1 or 2 technical volunteers. How long is it going to take them, who they don't work with this equipment every day? How long is it going to take them to set up for a new instrument, or 2 new instruments? It's not instant. It does take time. And that's kind of the human nature. Like, anytime we are um, working with a thing that we don't really understand, we tend to oversimplify it. And I think that it's important for churches to not oversimplify what happens, what it requires to do things technically. And so that means that throwing curveballs as rarely as possible. That means pre-planning and thinking ahead. Somebody needs, usually the worship pastor, but somebody needs to be thinking ahead of, like, okay, like, what inputs are we going to have on stage this weekend? Where are they going to be located? They need to be thinking about, how does that play with the lighting that we have? Is our talent going to be out of lighting and dim on camera? Um, they need to be thinking about, like, okay, like, what kind of time frame does my ProPresenter or whatever lyric software you use, what kind of time frame do they need to get ready for service? How does it affect things if I come to them in the tech booth 3 minutes before service and I'm asking changes? Because you've got them in a moment where they're trying to mentally prepare for the service that's about to come. They're kind of like running through things in their own in their mind, and now you've interrupted that, and you've come to them. Hey, can we change this one last thing? I think that probably the biggest thing is to I would if most people underestimate how much time your technicians need or your volunteer team needs to do with excellence, then maybe give them more time than you think is necessary. And if you give them more time than you think is necessary, you're probably giving them about the right amount of time.
That's good advice.
And so that's really more of a systems conversation. And so if somebody needs to know um, by let's say your rehearsal is on Thursday night, and they need to know by let's say 5 o'clock on Thursday what the input list and what the lighting cues need to be. Then where in your week, as a church tech staff or a church staff person, where in your week are you going to figure those things out? And what mechanism are you going to use to communicate that with your church team? ProPresenter or whatever. So I think that you really can't use technology to its fullest unless you're giving technicians the ability to react, the ability to plan. Because again, a lot of the technology that churches have is incredibly capable. The big differentiator is not actually the consoles or the lights or the speakers. More often than not, the big differentiator is the technicians. How much time do they have to prepare? How well trained are they? Those things are really the critical factors. And so it's more of a system thing, giving some dedicated time in your process, in your preparation process, to make sure that that team has what they need to avoid, the sort of last minute adjustments that throw people off, or you didn't give them time to prepare adequately, and so now we're rehearsal's about to begin or should be about to begin, but instead your technicians are running around like chickens with their head cut off, trying to patch in this thing that they didn't know about until they walked into the door. And so I think that after you've got the new technology, you need to make sure that your systems are capable of getting the most out of it.
Yeah, and that's assuming that nothing's broken that morning too, right? That's assuming
Yeah,
everything else is working perfectly
yeah,
fine.
because we all
And
know everything always works.
of course it does. I've never had something not work, especially when I need it to. I think the funny plight there, and maybe it's the endless battle of churches are a lot of times between kind of the lead visionaries of the church as an organization, which are tend to be big picture people. A lot of lead pastors are big picture or maybe exec pastors, and then you've got the technicians who are running all that who tend to be very detail oriented because it kind of takes that to run all that stuff. So the lead pastor comes in and says, "Hey, can we just do this real quick?" And then you got the engineer who's thinking, "Do you know how many things have to happen for that to work?
Right.
I've got to convert this file, bring it over into this system that needs to go through our Dante network. I need to get this repatched into this, and it
Yeah.
gets crazy from there, right? So
Yeah.
like finding ways to effectively build relationships, and this is really hard for both sides. I think trying to find ways to build relationships between the people who are running stuff on Sundays and the lead pastor, who may or may not assume that something's much easier than it is, because when you don't know the systems, you assume everything is simple. And the reality is the people that are really good at it make it look simple, but it's tremendously complicated.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that happens in a lot of relationships, where there's a burden to be borne. It happens in marriage. It happens in the church world, where we're all trying to push toward a goal together, and we each have our own part to play. It's a thing where we kind of ask, we say to ourselves, if they only knew what I'm going through, the lead pastor thinks about how much time it took to prepare that sermon, and the amount of times that he got distracted in the process, and I wanted to get you this information and I wanted to get you these slides, but if you only knew what I'm going through.
Yeah,
and,
exactly right.
and then for the technician, especially the volunteer technician, I wanted to get there at 5:30 to get ready for the rehearsal, but then I got held up at work, and and I had to come in at 6:15, and practice starts at 6:30. And if you only knew what I'm going through, wouldn't you just give me what I need to be prepared? And so we all kind of like had that thing where we sort of think about the burden that we bear, and we sort of underestimate the burden that other people bear. But I think you're right, Dusty. I think that relationship component of it is the thing that kind of brings the two together. And when the leadership team understands just what goes into the tech side of things, and when the tech people understand, like, hey, listen, and again, I know that it's not always true, but for a lot of churches, you have volunteer tech staff. When they understand, what it's like to be um, a staff member at a church that has, like, 3 or 4 full-time staff, and that, you're not just sitting around all day tossing darts, and that there is an immense amount of work to be done, but a small number of people to do it, and seem like there are mountains of expectations. I think when and I know I've been in tech settings, where the team is kind of griping about how things are, and well, we've talked to them, and they don't seem to understand us. I think that if each side kind of like had a clearer picture of what it's like to walk in the other person's shoes, then I think that the lines of communication would be more fruitful. I also think that kind of the default position on each, if we're to take ownership of sort of like our end of things, sort of the position we could take, regardless of what their stance is, the position we could take is, how can I help? Even though I feel like I'm a little overburdened, even though I feel like I'm spinning a million plates, going to that person on the other side of the tension and saying, how can I help? Is it trying to think, it is one of those things that bonds people together, and it puts defenses down. And this, I guess, this is something that's just, it's outside of church tech. It's just sort of a larger relationship thing, but it's true here as well. Is when you go to the other side of the tension and say, how can I help? When you go as a tech person, you say, like, hey, I see you've got a lot going on. Like, how can I help?
Yeah.
Yeah, and vice versa. It's an extremely powerful move.
Yeah, and I think the best lead pastors I've seen, or really pastoral staff in general, I've seen do that, are the ones that can come over and say, "Hey, I don't understand this, but help me understand it." Right?
Yep.
We're just asking for that little bit of like, "Hey, give me insight because I know I don't understand this." And same thing with our tech folks and our volunteers. Just creating this relationship where there's trust built on both sides, and it is, working in a church or volunteering in a church is a lot like a marriage. Everything's built on a relationship, and it's all built on trust.
Yeah.
And the same pitfalls can happen in that environment as can what happened in a marriage.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, I've got 2 more for you. These
Okay.
are great dialogues, man. All these can become mini podcasts of their own, but we'll get to some of those later. So what are some of the best tools in church tech that would make churches more impactful in getting their message across? So like what's the go-to things that you think every church needs to know exists out there that might help them be more impactful in their message?
Yeah. Well, the first one is a Stream Deck. If you have not ventured into the world of using a Stream Deck, yes,
Yeah,
in
they're
your
great.
tech booth, now is the time. Stream Decks are not that expensive, and again, I know I swim in expensive waters, but it's like $200 to I think the most expensive is less than three.
Yeah.
And a Stream Deck is basically an automation button pad. And there is software out there called Companion. It's called BidFocus Companion. It's open source and it's free. And there are people who have taken commands for almost every piece of equipment in your tech booth, and have taken the set of commands and made them so they're automatable with a Stream Deck. So that's true for like you say you have an X32. You can actually activate certain actions on your audio console with the push of a button. So if you want to turn on or off all effects, or you want to make a default adjustment to your stream mix, or if you've got a video that's going to play, and you want to mute all the band inputs and unmute the video inputs, like there are a host of I mean, almost limitless numbers of things you can do with the Stream Deck. But here's where it gets really cool: is that, let's say you've got Pro Presenter, and you can program in automations that activate actions on Pro Presenter and your audio console and your lighting console. So, let's say that it's 5 minutes till service start and it's time to start that countdown. You can hit a button on your Stream Deck. Your house lights go to the pre-service queue. Your countdown starts rolling. Your audio console mutes all the band inputs and unmutes the Pro Presenter inputs. And you start thinking about, and you can control your switcher, so that your switcher, like your Blackmagic switcher, automatically takes your Pro Presenter input. I mean, it's kind of bananas, and it gets really fun. Actually, it's almost, once you kind of start to get in the you sort of figure out how it all programs. It's like it's like, what else can we do next? Like, okay, like we can do this. Can we do this? Like, it gets to be just kind of a fun thing to explore, and it makes it so that there are less opportunities for human error. And I mean, imagine, like that one automation where you're going to a pre-service setting across all the different stations in your tech booth. That involves, if every station is manned, that involves 4 people executing perfectly simultaneously. Well, if you can automate that, then you literally the push of a button, and now, once again, we're talking about like pre-service. People are trying to get their head in the game. If you can automate it so you just push a button and everything just triggers, that means that you can just keep your head in the game. You can just keep thinking about, like, as an audio technician, you're like looking at the stage, and you're like, okay, like, all right, all the mics I need on stage, and just going through all your checklists. So Stream Decks are stinking awesome.
Yeah, I think the coolest use I saw for a Stream Deck, well, that I've seen live, was using it for key change automations for auto tune functions for churches that are
Yeah,
using that live,
yeah,
as opposed to trying to go through maybe like the Wave Super Rack or something like that, and which is a little clunky in its interface. But yes, I mean, Stream Decks you can do anything on. I'm still learning. Like, I just learned a whole bunch from what you just said that I didn't even think about. So thanks for that.
yeah. So Stream Deck is the bomb. And one little tip on Stream Deck for you. So when you get a Stream Deck, you can get Stream Deck software, and that allows you to build some automations in using the buttons we talked about. However, that is the Stream Deck software. You actually don't want to use that. You want to use the BitFocus software. So if you go to BitFocus, I think it's bitfocus.io. You can go there and you can download the software, the BitFocus companion software, and you never even want to launch the Stream Deck software after that point. And BitFocus is going to be the thing that controls that. And so it's pretty cool stuff. And again, totally free.
Yeah,
You
pro
could
tip.
do, yes. So don't use, not that you can't do anything cool with the Stream Deck stuff, but the BitFocus is the way to go. The other thing I would say is virtual sound check.
Oh yes, one of
Virtual
my
sound
favorite
check
things in the world. Yeah.
is, man, I mean, in the pro audio world, most audio engineers wouldn't, I mean, like, they would rather give up their pinky finger than to get rid of virtual sound check. It has become so integral to their workflows. And for those who don't know what the virtual sound check is, basically it is using your digital audio console, and virtually all of them can do it these days. I mean, even if you have an X32 or a QU16, like whatever, Personas, they all do it. It allows you to record the inputs from your audio console direct to any kind of recording software you have. And some of them actually allowed you to record directly to the console itself using like an SD card or a USB drive. But allows you to record each input separately. So like your kick drum gets recorded as its own input, and the snare, and so on and so forth. Allows you to record them all independently. And then here's the magic part. You can play them all back after rehearsal is over. You can play them all back through the same channels that you recorded them through. So your kick comes now through your kick channel, and your snare through your snare channel, so on and so forth. And now, rather than trying to get that perfect sound from your kick drum by having your drummer hit the kick drum for 5 minutes, now when they're out of the room, you go into virtual sound check and you play it back, and you spend as much time as you need, really listening to the way that EQ changes the sound of that kick drum, or listening to the way that compression changes the sound of that snare drum, or hearing like how moving your high pass up maybe further than you normally would changes or cleans up the tonality of a vocal, or like playing with a reverb, and like finding a reverb that you think like, hey, it gives me a sense of space, but it doesn't muddy up my mix. Like all of those things. It's like it allows you to perfect your craft. It allows you to spend more time really getting into the details and the minutia of a mix, more so than you ever would be able to do in a purely live setting. And audio engineering almost has two phases in development. The first phase is the operational phase. The operational phase is where you learn what all the knobs and buttons on an audio console do. And I know what an EQ does, and I know the difference between a DCA and a group. That's getting all of that is the operational side. And that doesn't actually take too long to develop. Watch enough YouTube videos and you spend enough time noodling around with an audio console. Never that I would do this, but while the pastor is speaking and second service, you're just kind of like pushing around in menus and all that kind of stuff. You can get operational knowledge. But it's the artistic knowledge that really takes the time to develop, because the artistic knowledge is like learning to play an instrument. And imagine if you were tasked with learning to play an instrument, but the only time you ever got to use the instrument was during a band rehearsal and during an actual service. So you get like a grand total of like 3 hours a week at best to practice your instrument. And because you're a weekend volunteer, you get to do that once a month. So it's really hard to get great at that craft if that's the only exposure you have. But with virtual sound check, you can, record rehearsal or record a service and come back in at some other point in time, or stay a little bit later and just play it back and just go hog wild. And it's that process that allows people to really develop their mixing skills. And so virtual sound check is the more opportunity, or sorry, every time I have the opportunity to use virtual sound check, I will absolutely take it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it goes back to the whole point of like, how do you invest in your people?
Yeah.
And that's one of those places where the technology has a direct impact on your people investment, because with that virtual sound check, like I use that to train sound people all the time, because that gives them, it's almost like a playground. It's like, hey, here's our service from last week. I'll pull the faders down to 0. Let's remix this, build a mix for me, and let's talk about it and let's play with it. And you can't beat that kind of hands-on training, because you can't recreate that, and you definitely don't want to do that in a live service for the first time. Like your live service is not your experimental playground, but that gives you one, which is so huge. Because like I taught piano lessons for years and years, and I know with any of my piano students, it's like if somebody said, hey, I'm going to practice for maybe an hour a week, maybe a couple hours a week, it'd be like, no, man, just stop doing it right now, because you're not going to get it very far. Right. But yet we expect a lot of our, road warrior, weekend warriors to come in and do exactly that, and to have a great mix. And hopefully that translates well to online. And it's kind of a losing equation, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, man, that's really good advice. I've got one more question for you before I let you go. And man, thank you for all these recommendations. This is such a good conversation. I wish we could keep having it for another couple hours, but that's where we get a little nerdy on our end, as my wife likes to say. She's come in and just start using terms like XLR cable and just make stuff. I was like, no, that's a real thing. Come on. Like, oh, my bad. So, question number 5: what is the single biggest recommendation you would make to churches that are trying to figure out where to start with what they need to invest in?
So it's kind of a triage question, right? What is the thing that has the is the biggest problem, and can all usually be what is the biggest problem and what can be solved with the best return on investment. And so I think the first thing is to figure out, like to go back to that question that or the thing we were talking about earlier, where it's like, okay, number one, what is our vision as a church? What are we about as a church? Um, and that can be somewhat informative because, like, if you've decided that as a church, one of your priorities is in-person community, then, well, that, like, hey, listen, our online stream can be a podcast. In-person community is what we prioritize. The second thing I would say is talk to your technicians, and say, hey, like, ask them, like, what are the things that seem to be the biggest modes of failure? What are the things that are being the biggest hindrance from your perspective that as a true leader you may not even know about? You may not even know that, like, your tech team that is back there, and they're holding it together with paper clips and scotch tape. So it's like, what are the things that, like, you're constantly trying to have to compensate for because it's not really working. Um, and then I think that the next question or the next thing to ask is, what is it that what is it going so you kind of ask the question from so you look at your vision and you say, okay, this is what we're about. And so because this is where we about what we're about, we know that we don't need to put a lot of money into this area. And then what we're about says sort of dictates, okay, so this is where we should. A little something going on there. Um,
Gremlins.
Hopefully it doesn't happen again. So because this is where we're about, what we're about. This is where we should put our money. So um, let's say that from a weekend experience, you've determined that your weekend experience is a is in first and foremost maybe a front door to the people who are far from God. And so, okay, like, so if our weekend experience prioritizes that, maybe some of your technical investment actually isn't even in the sanctuary itself. Maybe some of your technical investment is actually what happens in the lobby. And saying, okay, how can we make it so that the first 7 seconds when somebody walks through our doors, that they're immediately disarmed or they're immediately surprised in a positive way, because of the way that our space feels. And so it's like, all right, so if we know what we are about and how we want our services to play into our larger purpose as a church, um, then that kind of informs how you invest invest in technology. Um, I think that by and large, speaking outside of the vision side of things, I go into a lot of churches, and the thing I observe more than anything else, in terms of, like, opportunity for improvement, is first I see a lot of audio systems that are not, because of what the era that they were installed from and the technology that was available at that time. I see a lot of audio systems that could definitely, like, there would be a very discernible improvement if you got new equipment. Um, even from 15 years ago, speaker technology has evolved by leaps and bounds in the last 15 years. And the way that a speaker sounds now, even kind of a mid-price speaker, sounds so much better than what existed before. And that doesn't mean that, like, any old operator can make it sound like magic. You still need to invest in your team. But
Yeah.
by and large, investing, the return on investment in new audio equipment is pretty significant, especially as it comes to new PA, because PA technology has gotten significantly better. The second would be, I think that video technology is another opportunity for a high return on investment. Cameras from 10 years ago compared to cameras today is almost mind blowing. Some of the cameras from, like, for example, Blackmagic. I remember, I actually have a background in video production from way back when. I remember when I was heavy in that. If somebody had a camera, or there was a manufacturer that had a camera that had 14 stops of dynamic range, I mean, it was hard to fathom something that performed that well. And now you get that with a Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera, which is like,
Yeah. It's amazing.
yeah, it's like $1,500 with a lens.
Yeah, and like 6K, I think, and
Oh, it's it's
yeah.
it's incredible, incredible. So if you're a church and you've got cameras that you bought 10 years ago, and you're thinking, is it worth, is there going to be a noticeable difference for us to improve our camera systems? The answer is absolutely. You can get that's probably what you're probably using, a 6K right now, aren't you?
I'm not using one yet. We did it
Oh,
at the
okay.
church I came from, but that'll be probably our next investment if anyone's listening. Maybe
But yeah,
go wireless with a couple of them. But
yeah,
yeah, I mean, they do look so good.
yeah. And it's almost like cheating. Um, the older camera systems were uh, so sensitive to variations in brightness on your stage. They were so sensitive to, like, you had to have like the highest quality of color rendering. It's called CRI. If you had a lighting fixture that was a lower CRI fixture, you knew it. It looked horrible on camera. And now these new cameras, they're so forgiving. It's pretty cool. It's like cheating in a great way. So I would say that would be another opportunity for investment. If you're like, hey, where are we really going to see the changes for the money we spend?
Yeah,
Yeah,
and I love that because cheating is what we're looking for when we're
yes,
trying to figure out what's the best bang for our buck when we're running things with, people that are only here a few hours a week and we're trying to train as many people as possible, right? We need
yes,
as much stuff that will let us cheat as possible.
yes. Now, in the lighting world, I would say, there's a lot of churches that are making a big push to convert to LED. And I would say hold off a little bit longer on that, as it pertains to, like, your front wash.
Mhm.
Hold off on that for a little bit longer, because the LED fixtures that look as good as an incandescent fixture are still pretty stinking expensive.
Yeah.
Um, and like, you've already made a significant investment in your current lighting rig. For most churches, I mean, don't get me wrong, there are definitely some churches that it's like, okay, like, these fixtures are going to be really hard to work with. Um, but a lot of churches, the investment you've made in your current lighting is not insignificant. And the only thing you need to do to continue using that investment is occasionally change a bulb, um, and you need to pay the power bill. And so upgrading to LED fixtures, the return on investment in terms of power savings is still kind of long. It's going to be probably a decade to really get the return on investment there. Um,
Yeah.
so like, the pros for me. I mean, like, now I'm an audio guy, although I used to do a lot of lighting back in the day. To me, the pros and cons of going, to a fully LED rig, it's not there yet. It's not an easy pull of the trigger. Now, like, if you're doing a large renovation, um, then maybe it makes sense to go to LED. If you're going to have to basically deconstruct your entire lighting rig as it is, and you have to, there's a lot of labor in that in and of itself. In the cost to go LED is incremental to the larger project, maybe it makes more sense to do that. The other scenarios where it may make more sense to go LED are when you have fixtures that are really hard to access. Like I know there are a lot of churches out there that have got the high A-frames, and it's like, if a fixture goes out, we better wait until 3 go out to go up there
Yeah.
and change a
Before we go
bulb.
rent the lift or get the big
Yeah,
giant ladder out. Yeah.
yeah. So, in those scenarios, yeah, it makes more sense to go LED just because like the amount of dead bulbs that you're going to have before you finally do something about it gets to be kind of excessive. Um, and also in those scenarios, it may actually make sense to get a fixture that is a moving head fixture. So that if you need to re-aim a light, again, like it's not something that requires you to need a lift or scaffolding or anything like that. It's something you can just do from the lighting console. And so it makes it much easier to use in that regard. But yeah, so I would say, first and foremost, actually, I'm going to reverse myself a little bit. First and foremost, the return on investment in cameras is kind of huge. I mean, like the new stuff looks so much better. Like it is pretty dramatic. Second to that would be PA. If you have a speaker system that's 20 years old, I guarantee you will hear a huge difference with a new, even moderately priced PA. Speaker technology has come leaps and bounds. And then the last would be, lighting. Some applications, it makes sense to convert to LED, but I think for a lot, it still makes sense to kind of hold on to the incandescents and dimmer racks.
Very good, man. That's all tremendous advice. And I think as long as everything aligns to your vision, what I'm hearing number one is that it's not going to probably benefit me to go out and spend $100,000 on a giant LED wall. Maybe it will, but
Maybe
probably not,
will. I
right?
mean,
Unless it's part of my vision, right?
yeah,
Um, I think getting churches to align and figure out what is it that we're trying to do, even going back to the online thing, are we an online first church, which is a certain model out there? Do we see that as our front door, like you said, or is this more kind of a utility for people that aren't here, but we still want to push the in-person community? So we don't want to make it, so good that it starts to compete against the in-room experience. And, all those questions have to be answered for every single church, right? Because every church is going to pursue things differently. And you don't want to compare church A over here who really values their online experience as a top priority versus church B over here that is trying to keep up, but they don't necessarily need to do that. And all of that has a huge effect on the budget and how a church invests in its resources. And as well as I do, technology is one piece of what a church can invest in,
yeah.
and you've still got the rest of the church, right? And that's kind of the world that we tend to live in, when we come from these kind of tech backgrounds. But man, I think exactly what you said of like walking in the door. What does this first 7 seconds feel like when you enter a church campus? Maybe it's even outdoor speaker system or something like that,
Yeah.
to create that experience as you're pulling into the parking lot. There's you can be as creative as possible, and technology should always aid that. And I love that thought from you.
Yeah. And I would say, just kind of as a little tag here, that it's important to know, like if you're a church and you're kind of at a threshold where you're like, okay, like we are at um, a scale where we have the potential to get into some of the more advanced equipment. Like now you're at a scale where it's like, hey, we're kind of talking about an LED wall. Um, or now we're kind of talking about like an audio console that is in the tens of thousands of dollars price. Um, if you're kind of in that realm, or you're looking to do like serious multi-camera production, it's important to know that that level of production absolutely requires dedicated staff, um, and dedicated staff that have enough time. It's usually dedicated full-time staff, because equipment requires attention. You have to have time to do, all this setup for the stage. You have to have time, to load in all the graphics. You have to have time to develop all the lighting cues. You have to have time to troubleshoot the things that aren't working. You have to have time to be able to move things forward and incrementally take things, to the next level. And, that kind of time is not something that you can really reasonably expect out of most volunteer environments. And so like if you're kind of like getting to that point in time, if you're considering to buy an LED wall, maybe it's time to ask, should we buy or should we allocate for a staff person instead?
Beautiful
It,
advice.
you're likely going to get a better return on your investment from a dedicated staff person than you would from an LED wall.
Yep, that's huge. And yeah, it all comes down to people power at the end of the day to run all this stuff and even your systems to be in place to figure out, if you're making last minute changes, probably an LED wall where, it's hugely graphics and environmentally
Yeah,
heavy is probably not what you want to lean into.
for
Well,
sure.
Bob, hey, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, man. I mean, I love, your knowledge and your heart both come through. And I think you've got some great words of wisdom there for churches that are really trying to navigate these kinds of conversations, especially as time goes on. So for churches that do want to get in contact with you, I know you help partner with churches all over the place. What's their best way to reach you?
So first, you can go to ovationaudiovisual.com, and we have a contact us form through that. The second way is you can actually just email me directly if you want. My email address is bob@ovationav, as in Alpha Victor, bob@ovationav.live. So bob@ovationav.live.
Awesome. Well, hey, thank you again, man. It's been a pleasure having you on, and we appreciate all your insight.
My pleasure. Thanks, Dusty.
Absolutely. Hey, remember, leaders, it's not just about throwing money at the latest and greatest things in your churches. It's about starting with a vision and building from there. So, hey, thank you again for listening to the Kingdom Calibrate podcast. I hope you'll tune in next week as we have an honest conversation about eliminating our ego as leaders and helping to elevate other leaders around us. And hey, for more info about joining the movement of next generation church leaders, visit us at www.kingdomcalibrate.com, and you can sign up right now to join the Leaders Circle beginning in August of 2023, where you get to join in with a group of 11 other leaders with personal coaching sessions to help you build your teams, create sustainable systems of growth in your church, increase your volunteers, and grow key leaders on your influence. Remember, no matter what your position, you do have influence. Use it to build God's kingdom and not your own. And we'll see you next week.